Morgan Rourke,
Mackenzie Haugen,
Luke Kerr,
Landon Chandler.
Madeline Hochschul.
Imagine being in war-torn Poland in 1941 as an 18-year-old, taken from your family, stuck waiting for the day of your possible demise. This is the situation that Rachel Leskowitz was in when she was in Krakow, in the midst of a Nazi ghetto during the midst of the Holocaust, one of the most famous genocides in history. This is from Holocaust Centers for Humanity, a nonprofit organization for 30 years teaching lessons of the Holocaust and the story of local survivors, updated August 2017.
We have all learned about the Holocaust in school, but we haven't learned about other genocides around the world, and they have not seen the appropriate attention.
There have been many devastating genocides around the world throughout history.
First, we will talk about the Armenian Genocide. Second, we will talk about the Holodomor Genocide.
Third, we will talk about the Cambodian Genocide. Fourth, we will talk about the Rwandan Genocide. And finally, we will talk about Darfur. First, we are going to inform you on the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian Genocide was the first genocide of the 20th century. It began in 1915 when a group called the Young Turks took over Armenia. As stated in an interview with Mr. Rash, a Zembroda Mazeppa high school history teacher for 20 years with a master's degree in education on December 20th, 2019. The Young Turks felt that the Armenians were too untrustworthy to have in their army in the fight against the Russians in World War I. But they also did not want them on the Russian side, so their solution was to wipe them out. The first stage of the genocide was to segregate the men. They marched them out not far out of their cities to the butcher squad. Sometimes there would be 200 to 400 men at a time brought out to be killed. The only way someone would be able to survive was if they had taken shelter under their friends' dead bodies. Then they would have to wait until the butcher squad left, convinced everyone was massacred. And then they would have to flee to another country to safety. According to Richard G. Hovhannisyan, an Armenian American historian and professor emeritus at the University of California, in the journal Facing History and Ourselves on September 10, 2018. The only people left in the cities were women, children, and the elderly. They were marched out of their cities and told to pack light because they were going to be temporarily relocated. These marches were sometimes weeks and months long to Syria. They were denied food and water in the hot sun of the desert by their guards. To protect their daughters, the women would cut their hair and smear dirt on them to make them less attractive to men. These women also were subjected to horrible conditions like rape and physical and mental abuse. These women, the only way that many of the people that were most likely to be saved from this were women that were married off or taken into Muslim homes. They were forced to have the children of the men's household that they were living in. They were forced to have the children of the men's household that they were living in. And when there was finally rescue provided to these women, they were faced with a difficult choice. They could either go back to their families and leave their children, or they could never see their family again and stay with their children. The death toll of the genocide was between 500,000 and 700,000 people. Some would say that the dead were the lucky ones because they did not have to witness the horrid torture and treatment of their people. The government to this day still denies the horrible treatment and genocide of these people. Now that we have informed you on the Armenian Genocide, let's move on to the Holodomor Genocide.
The Holodomor Genocide was short but had a great impact on the Ukraine. Dr. Ellen Kennedy, founder and executive director of A World Without Genocides, in the publication The Holodomor 1932 through 1933, published March 2017, states that the word Holodomor in Ukraine means hunger and extermination. This was a man-made famine of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The cause of this famine was because of Stalin's new policy that ended in many deaths. This new policy was called the collectivization policy. The collectivization policy led to a drop in production, the disorganization of rural economy, and food shortages. 10 million people, because of these food shortages, died of starvation alone. And because of all of these food shortages, people became more and more violent and killing 7 million more people. Another thing with this policy was Stalin's goal, and his goal in this policy was to increase productivity, and by doing this, he would eliminate small, privately held farmland, and then he would turn to mass agricultural policies. Today there is a memorial in Washington, D.C., and because of Stalin making this goal, millions of people had to suffer and died just because he wanted to have more power. Now that I have talked about the Holodomor Genocide, we will now discuss the Cambodian Genocide.
Cambodian Genocide was a brutal massacre that affected millions of people's lives. Cambodian Genocide started in 1975 when Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge took control of Cambodia by force. Cambodia is a small Asian country located between Thailand and Vietnam. Before 1975, Cambodia was subjected to the battle of communism versus democracy that plagued the world during the Cold War era. The Khmer Rouge was backed by Mao Zedong in communist China. Pol Pot idealized a country of independent agricultural farmers, which meant that they had to make their own medicine, clothes, which they were not able to do so. They had no knowledge in the field. According to James A. Tyner, a professor of geography at Kent State University, in his book, The Killing of Cambodia, published in 2017, Pol Pot was unremorseful for his actions, and he really believed that this was the right thing to do, which showed how brutal of a person he really was. The Cambodian Genocide targeted many different people. According to Howard J. Denicke, who was a PhD in cultural anthropology, in the book Genocide in Cambodia, published in 2016, the people that were targeted were people that lived in cities because they wanted to combat the westernization of France and Cambodia and get rid of cities. And they were moved with force from the cities. Next, they targeted people of the military of the previous government. Then they killed the clergy and any religious leaders to eliminate any morale that was possible. Then they killed the scholars, and then they killed the minorities. All these people were seen as threats to their agricultural society. They had many punishments for these people. According to Catherine Gruspier, who has a PhD in physical anthropology, as she wrote in Forensic Pathology Journal, published in 2017, they were punished with labor, which included digging mass graves where people were killed in the graves. They dug their own graves. The next thing that was caused was disease, as many curable diseases were uncurable because medical facilities were eliminated. so diseases like malaria went rampant in these areas. Starvation was also a key reason of death in this area. Torture and murder were also very consistent. It is unknown how many deaths occurred in the Cambodian genocide, but it is predicted to be around 1.5 to 2 million people. That's over a fourth of their country that was killed. The Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot were eventually overrun. Now that I've talked about the Cambodian genocide, we'll now discuss the Rwandan genocide.
The Rwandan Genocide was a mass slaughter of Hutu and Tutsi people in 1994 that has left lasting effects on the country and its people. Years prior to the genocide, Rwanda gained its independence in 1962, and by 1973 had appointed a new leader in Juvenal Habyarimana. In 1988, in the neighboring country of Uganda, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, is being formed. The RPF is a political party based out of Rwanda that is comprised mostly of Tutsi people that place blame on the Rwandan government for failing to direct Tutsi refugees. You're probably wondering the difference between Hutu and Tutsi people. The difference between Hutu and Tutsi people depended on their proximity to the god. For example, if you were wealthy, owned a lot of cattle, and were closer to the god, then you were Tutsi. And if you were not as wealthy, didn't own very many cattle, and were far from the god, then you were Hutu. In the late 80s, Rwanda's economy was struggling due to world coffee prices dropping. And at this time, the RPF invaded the country, starting a civil war. By 1993, hate and violence is being spread and broadcasted throughout the country via TV and radio. On April 6, 1994, Juvenal Habyarimana was killed when his plane was shot out of the sky. According to Jennifer Rosenberg, writer and historian who has a bachelor's degree in history, in her journal titled A Timeline of the Genocide in Rwanda, published in 2019, states that this marked the official beginning of the Rwandan Genocide. Shortly after, Hutu extremists began killing their political opponents, including the Prime Minister. Things were taking a turn for the worse after a series of church massacres targeting Tutsi people, the most notable being the Gikondo, Narubai, and Kibai massacres. Another 50,000 Tutsi people were killed in the hills of Bisesero, and even more were being killed throughout the country in towns, hospitals, and churches. At this point in the genocide, 250,000 Tutsi people have fled to neighboring country Tanzania, and at this time, the RPF has seized control of the presidential palace. After that, the French had provided a safe zone in the southwest corner of Rwanda. Many Hutu fled there or fled to neighboring country Zaire. Mid-July 1994, the Rwandan Patriotic Front gained control of the country, marking the end of the Rwandan Genocide. According to Mahmoud Mamdani, an author who earned a PhD from the University of Harvard, in his book titled When Victims Become Killers, Colonial Nativism and the Genocide in Rwanda, published in 2019, states that the perpetrators viewed themselves as the victims of an ongoing political drama. Yet yesterday's victims will soon be victims again. The Rwandan Genocide had a casualty total of over 500,000 deaths. According to Harris Said, a writer and engineer, in his book titled War, Violence, Terrorism in Our Present World, published in 2017, states that greed, anger, and jealousy are what fueled the division and violence among these people. Now that I've talked about the Rwandan Genocide, we can now talk about the Darfur Genocide.
The Darfur Genocide has lasted for over a decade. This is from Anna Heyman, a former senior research policy fellow at NGO, a nonprofit working group focused on women, peace, and security, published in the Security Council report for the United Nations, updated September 2019. This started as a civil war between pastoralists and secondary farmers. Pastoralists who raise livestock and secondary farmers who grow crops. This was because of nomadic pastoralism. Nomadic pastoralism is when you bring your livestock around to give them the necessary food that they need. In layman's terms, the livestock was eating the secondary farmers' crops illegally. Because of this, in 2003, the Sudan government came in and stepped into this situation, and because of that, it caused an uprising. Luckily, in that same year, there was a ceasefire signed between these two groups. Hala Mohammed, a survivor of one of the Janjaweed attacks in Darfur in 2003, she was 24 at the time, and because of her resistance of the Janjaweed, she was shot and raped. Luckily, her and her 4 children made it out alive and now living in the U.S. She now has a platform to tell her story about the issues in Darfur. In 2004, the UN, or the United Nations, more known as the UN, proclaimed that the Janjaweed, a pro-government group, was killing innocent African villagers, even though this had been happening for a year before then. Later in that same year, they concluded that the Janjaweed's killings were classified as genocide. In 2006, the Sudan government decided that this was too big of an issue for them to handle alone, so they finally agreed to let the UN come in with their troops and help them fight against the Janjaweed. In that same year, the government and 2 smaller rebel groups signed a peace agreement, but that didn't help this situation at all. Now, let's talk about more recent news. In 2011, a key leader of the Janjaweed was killed by the government. This slowed down the killings rapidly, but not completely. In 2016, the International Monetary Fund, or more known as the IMF, raised the price of basic goods because of private and public protest against the government. The government didn't like this so much, so they were fighting against the civilians. They removed people from office who were supporting these protests, and they banned all media coverages of them. Due to the extreme force of the government, 40 people were killed, 40 protesters were killed. In 2017, these prices had come back down, but only to rise again in the following year, due to the government removing their funding for these basic goods. In 2019, the government of Sudan finally declared a state of emergency. In that same year, the military decided to overthrow the government successfully. At the end of 2019, there's a new government in Sudan, and they have a power sharing agreement between the government, the military, and civil representatives. As of 2013, 300,000 people have been killed in the Darfur Genocide. This number will keep going up without a permanent solution.
First, we talked about the Armenian Genocide, and second, we talked about the Holodomor Genocide.
Third, we talked about the Cambodian Genocide. Fourth, we talked about the Rwandan Genocide. And finally, we talked about Darfur.
There have been many devastating genocides around the world throughout history.
Felicia would soon escape the Krakow ghetto, and then later was caught and sent to Auschwitz.
A while after, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen and liberated in April of 1945. Luckily, or not many people have made it out of these genocides, but luckily Felicia was